We are so honored to be hosting Oscar Cásares, and I'm sorry about that, the author of Where We Come From. We're going to be in conversation with Tessa Bartels, the book concierge, the friend of all libraries, and a member of more book clubs than you can probably count. Oscar Cásares is the author of the story collection Brownsville and the novels Amigo Land and the new book Where We Come From, which the Texas Institute of Letters selected as the winner of the Jesse H. Jones Award for Best Work of Fiction in 2019. His essays have appeared in Texas Monthly, the New York Times, Washington Post, and NPR, focusing on the South Texas and US-Mexico border, where he grew up and his family began to settle since the mid-1800s. He's won fellowships from the NEA, the Copernicus Society, and the Guggenheim Foundation, and teaches creative writing at the University of Texas in Austin. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Daniel.
Before we always love to sort of set the mood by asking the author to just say a few words about the book. We're going to ask you plenty, so you don't have to say too much, and also maybe read a couple of pages from the book to let everybody know that we're not in a podcast. This is a book.
Okay, here we go. Well, first of all, thank you again for inviting me. This is I've been looking forward to this evening, and so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the book. The book obviously deals, at least on the surface and the way it's been talked about, it deals with immigration. Though I will say that the book started in a different space and only became a book about immigration quite a bit, into the process as I began to learn more and more about these characters. And so the story takes place in Brownsville, Texas, at the very, very tip of the state. And it's set in contemporary times, and it deals with a older woman, a retired school teacher, and she's retired a few years before she anticipated arriving at that stage of life. And she retired because she needed to stay home and take care of her elderly mother. And so her life is pretty much limited to taking care of the mother and being around the house, because the mother's bedridden and can't really care for herself. And the only time that she is able to get away from the house, or the only real visitor she has on a consistent basis, is her maid, a woman who crosses the bridge weekly to come and clean her house. So she crosses over from Matamoros to Brownsville, cleans the house, and then goes back across. And if you're not familiar with this part of the country, this happens on a daily basis. There's a fair amount of traffic of people working, coming to work on the U.S. side and then going directly back to their homes in Mexico. One day, the maid, though, she asks her a question. She asks her for a favor, and it's a little bit odd what she asked her. She asked the retired school teacher, Nina, if she can bring her daughter and granddaughter from Mexico to the house the next week, and if they can stay at the house for a night. And the reason that she wants, and she's got this plan laid out, the reason she wants to do this is that someone is going to come and pick up the daughter and granddaughter and then smuggle them north. So one of the things again, if you're not familiar with the area, there is the international boundary, the river, which we see in the news often enough. But in truth, there are two boundaries, two borders. There's that physical border, and then there's the interior border, which is about 100 miles north of the river. And this pretty much exists throughout the borderlands. So once you cross into the US, you will encounter a checkpoint. And these checkpoints are set up strategically in ways that you can't really venture too far without encountering the Border Patrol. And so even once you get into the country, now you've got to find a way to get past the checkpoint. And this becomes, in ways, even more dangerous than crossing into the country. So Nina is really conflicted whether to do this favor for her maid. Basically, you know, the maid's daughter is going, and the granddaughter are going to stay in this little house behind the main house. And so all Nina has to do is look the other way and let this sort of happen without her taking too much notice. She goes back and forth on it, and finally she decides she's going to do it. She's thinking, this is the one time I'm going to do it, and it's never going to happen again. And as you can imagine, that was the first mistake. So I'm going to pick up the scene on the after she's decided to do this, and the daughter and granddaughter are already staying in the little pink house behind the main house, and this was originally a rental property. So they're hiding back there, waiting for somebody to arrive for them and then smuggle them. The next night, the same car, instead of opening the front door and scaring the driver off, this time Nina walked out back and down to the carport, passing in and out of the shadows in her housecoat and chanclas. That afternoon, to keep the dog from barking and calling attention to anyone pulling up to the house, she'd moved her to the backyard and chained her to the foundation block under the little pink house. By the time she opened the driveway gate, the driver had lowered the passenger window and angled the front tires toward the driveway. "Maybe you can help me," the driver said, leaning against the armrest. "I'm looking for a friend." 3 weeks from now, this is the moment Nina will remember and wonder why she ever got involved with these people, why she didn't just say no, that she didn't know anything about any friend and leave it at that, why she couldn't figure out another way of helping Romalda's family, a way that didn't involve her own family. But right then, Nina was trying to make sense of the driver being female. Her dark hair was tucked into a hooded sweatshirt. She had on French nails and was scratching at the leather on the steering wheel. There had been no buenas tardes, no I'm so-and-so, even if so-and-so was probably a made-up name. Maybe it was best this way, as strangers. "This friend is expecting you?" The girl looked at her like it might be a trick question. She seemed barely old enough to be out of high school, young enough to be Nina's granddaughter. "2 friends," she corrected herself. "And if not, then maybe I'm in the wrong place. They just told me it was the blue one at the dead end of the street. But then the light isn't so good." "It looks more blue in the day," Nina said. "And this is the only one with people at the very end." She stepped aside for the girl to pull into the driveway, then the carport. "Wait here," Nina said when the girl was getting out of the car. In the halo of the light from the back porch, they could see the shape of the little pink house in the distance. "First, I have to see them, to know if these are the right friends." "How many friends could be waiting for you?" Nina said. "Already at this hour." The girl was shorter and heavier than it had seemed she might be when she was slouched inside the car. As soon as the gate creaked open, La Bronca came tearing out from underneath the pink house, snarling like she'd been waiting all day only for this. Kind of a mean one, no? She's not there to make friends. La Bronca strained against the chain, struggling to move forward as if she might dislodge the little house from its foundation blocks and drag it with her. Nina shushed her, but this only seemed to infuriate the dog more, and she finally had to threaten to fling one of her chanclas at the animal before it relented. Looks like a dollhouse, the girl said, because of the color. She tapped on the door with her nails, like she was dropping by a neighbor's apartment to borrow a cup of sugar. When there was no answer, she rapped on the door. This time, the little girl, Brianna, cried somewhere inside the house, and a few seconds later, Naomi peeked through the blinds and then released the deadbolt. After being shut for 2 days, the door finally unsealed itself from the frame like an abandoned refrigerator, taking its first gasp of fresh air. A couple of minutes later, the four of them walked out to the car. Before they left, the driver put her hand out to shake Nina's and pressed a $50 bill into her palm. For your help. Nina held the bill for the girl to take back. If she didn't accept the money, they couldn't say she had done anything wrong. It was just a favor for a friend. The girl backed away, her hands held in front of her chest. Keep it, she said. There might be more friends who need favors now that we know where you live. Thank you.
I'm going. So Tessa and I are gonna. We've never done one together. We did go to do an event together where Tessa was doing the conversation, and she's probably been to an event where I've done the conversation. So we're going to try to go back and forth. I have a natural opening question, which is I read somewhere that you actually got the idea for the book when you were on leave in Germany. And I was wondering if you could mention like what was the first moment of the book? Like, you've written about Brownsville a lot, so the setting was there already.
Yeah, well, what I knew was that what I was interested in was the idea of identifying with a place as the boy in the story, Nina's godson, who will eventually make his way into the story. His entire family is from Brownsville, and they speak of Brownsville like it's the homeland, and yet this boy has grown up far away from there. He's grown up in a fairly affluent neighborhood in Houston, so he has no connection with it. But when he comes down for the summer, he's going to learn something about his godmother that he didn't know, and so I knew that was going to take place, and I knew more or less that he was going to encounter something that was just going to rock his world, and I had the idea that it was going to be something having to do with human trafficking. But I had a really vague idea. I had been thinking about it for probably 2 years prior to that. When I was in Germany, this is in Augsburg in southern Germany, Bavaria. I was teaching there for about 5 weeks, but the first 3 weeks I was there without my family, and so I had just so much time to myself to sort of mull this over and to finally begin to write the first pages of it, and then ultimately commit to it, and just say that this is going to be the story, and I don't know where it's headed, but I know this much about it. So that, but that idea of home, and what home means, and are we required to physically be in that home for it for us to identify with it, was the first instance of the story, and then came the human trafficking part.
So Oscar, when you get an idea for a book, are you starting with the characters or are you starting with the plot?
A little of both. You know, as far as just the, you know, conceptually, just trying to wrap my head around, is this a character and is this a situation that I want to spend, you know, because it's going to take a couple years to write. And, you know, maybe even more importantly, is this a situation, a plot, a character that a reader would want to spend time with? And that probably weighs more heavily on me than the other part. And this goes back really to my the beginnings of my relationship with books and with writing. I grew up in a house with no books, so I had no books in my young life, nor in my early adult life, and I really did not fully engage with literature until I was in my 30s and started writing. But this idea of coming, and I had a career that, you know, there was no reason to leave. I was doing quite well, but I had grown up around storytellers, and I felt like, you know, there was something pulling me toward that, the idea of you know, recounting and chronicling my family's story and getting these stories out into the world, I felt was important. And so I took that leap. And I mention that because, you know, coming from that vantage point of not having just, you know, books as a part of my life, as I think is the typical story, right? The young, the kid that might have been you, Tessa, who had the library card and was on friendly basis with the librarian and read everything that there was. And I was the kid who was out running around in the streets, and you couldn't put a book in front of me. Coming to it from that vantage point, I just felt, you know, that I talked to my classes quite a bit about this, the idea, and this was a learning process for me, but the difference between having somebody in front of you, and I'm not just saying virtually in front of you, but literally in front of you, where you're making eye contact and where you know that your story is connecting with them, and they are following it, and they are grimacing, or they are, you know, laughing, or all the reactions are happening in real time. And so that was my basis for, I mean, that sort of made up for this deficiency, at least at the beginning. And then the trick was, how do I go from that to actually writing the stories? Because then there's a huge difference, right? And there are things that both ways of telling a story have advantages and disadvantages. But that idea of, is this something that a reader is going to want to spend a weekend with, a week with, maybe a couple of weeks with? Are these characters that they're going to, you know, bring into their homes, bring into their hearts? The other part, I mean, once I've arrived at or committed to that idea, those characters, and that you know, that sense of where the plot is going, is the next thing, and this you know, becomes just as challenging, is hearing the narrative voice for the story. Where is this voice coming from? What is what you know, sort of psychically, where is this voice? Where is it coming to us? I mean, if we know if it's a first person, that you know, that it is this character relaying their experience, But then there's also the question of how close are they to that experience? Is it something that happened in their childhood? Is there something that happened that's still happening? In this case, you know, I felt that there was so much that I wanted to communicate early on, and I didn't quite know how to get into it. What appears in the book as the prologue ended up being the very first words that I wrote, for which doesn't always happen. And you know, I understood that Nina's godson was going to arrive. She wasn't going to be able to tell him what she was doing, what she had gotten herself involved in, and so she was going to have this secret that she was going to have to shield him from. And what that required was that she not let him get anywhere near this pink house that's directly behind the main house. So she, you know, as any of you out there who have raised kids, you know, that the first thing you got to do is set some boundaries, right? You may do this, but you may not do this. You may go here, but you may not do that. And so she goes through a whole litany of sort of boundaries, and she, you know, in the prologue, they're called those rules, but they're all designed to keep the child away from the pink house, and more importantly, from finding out what she's been involved in. And that for me was I mean, once I heard her voice, I won't say that the rest was easy, but I knew that I could follow her the rest of the way.
I do love her as a character, and I was going to say, so you tell a child, don't go in the basement. that works really well, right?
Yeah.
The famous song from the Fantastics, Never Say No. So why did the kids put jam on the cat? They did it because you said no.
But and not to give too much away, though, we have to advertise this as an event with event with spoilers. It's a paperback. The book's been out for a while, but it's really hard not to talk about the book without mentioning the third main character, Danielle, who is, you know, who plays such an important part of the book, both as a counterpoint. Do you want to say a little about him too?
Yeah, you know, there are at a certain point there are what they refer to as loads of immigrants coming through the property, and eventually that dies off. But there remains one boy who is who's sort of broken away from the traffickers and is trying to find his father, but has lost in getting away from the traffickers, basically lost all of his possessions, and comes knocking on Nina's door, and Nina is now, you know, lost as to what to do with this boy, and decides to shelter him. Again, you know, in a very sort of conflicted way. Not entirely. She was, you know, I don't think she envisioned herself being an activist or anything of the kind. She was living a fairly quiet life, and then found herself in this situation. So now she's got this boy in the pink house, and she's got this other boy in the main house, and again, you know, she's trying to keep her godson from finding out, and keep these two boys apart from one another. As time goes on, I think she begins to learn things, and we learn things about her that she wasn't willing to admit initially. Things about her past, things about her motivations as to why she's keeping the boy, you know, the reasons that she absolutely doesn't want her godson to know. These all begin to sort of reveal themselves as we get deeper and deeper into the story.
Tessa?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that really struck me about the book is that mother-child relationship that weaves through every single one of these characters. So you have Nina and her mother, you have Orly and his mother, you have Daniel and his mother, you have Beto and his mother, and you have both Danielle and Orly and their surrogate mother, Nina. So it's just mother-child relationship over and over and over again in all its various forms. And I just thought that was really brilliantly done, the way it just connects all of them, because regardless, obviously, of your background, we all have mothers and we all have those relationships. Or in some form or fashion. I thought you did a brilliant job writing this woman and writing the teen boys. I mean, how is it that you could get your head and get my head? How could you get my head into both of those? You know, I've never been a teenage boy, and yet I really thought that I could understand what they were going through and feel what they were going through. And I've never been in Nina's position either, but I certainly had a mother that needed care. I had brothers that might or might not take their share of the caregiving, etc.
Yeah, I to answer your question, I think and this goes for every character, even the ones that I feel that I can most readily identify with. I begin with at a really a stage of humility in the sense of not assuming that I know anything about these characters, not assuming that I would instantly know what this immigrant boy is experiencing. I've never been an immigrant. I've never been shuffled around with traffickers. I've not had that experience. I did not grow up in an affluent neighborhood in Houston, Texas. I was not a retired school teacher. So there were things that I could only learn with time, with spending more and more time with the character, writing about them, writing. The book is 300 plus pages, or is it 300? Forgetting how long my own book is. 250 or so. I probably wrote twice that amount, when it came down to it, for in my attempt to learn about the characters, what made them tick, where their soft spots were, where were the things that they were trying to conceal from one another, from themselves, because that's another theme that runs through it. I will say that, and I'm glad you pointed that out, and I would love to take credit for having designed this sort of matrix with all these mothers connected, but it was not anything that I designed in any way. For me, I feel most comfortable when I'm not imposing a specific structure on the story, where I'm not saying, well, it must work this way, and thematically I want this. If something, comes from the story organically, or is maybe hinted at, and I feel like I can, accentuate it some more, I might, but I try not to do anything that doesn't feel like it's already part of the story, and I'm just discovering it.
And yet these things happen anyway. So subconsciously, somebody's, there's something in your head that, like the parallel grieve, all the characters are grieving. They're all displaced. They're, and part of that probably brings them closer together because they can kind of feel it. But seriously, really, you didn't like, everyone's going to have to be suffering a loss in this book.
No. What's your loss? No. Okay. No.
The loss checklist.
Yeah. Your loss is not enough. I got to give you a little bit more loss. No. No, it was, what is this character dealing with, and what is their, what frightens them? What keeps them up at night? What would be horrible if, their sister or mother or someone found out about them? And a lot of that stuff doesn't even make it into the story, quite frankly. But I know it. I have by the time that the book, goes to publication, I pretty much know these characters inside and out. I have a clear sense of how they would react in their moment, in a given moment. I mean, it reminds me, I was listening to this, I was watching this documentary this weekend. Gets back a little bit to your question earlier, Tessa, about how I may have gotten you closer to Nina's character or to the boys. And this was it was a quote from Allen Ginsberg. And he said it about poetry, but I'm gonna I'm gonna borrow it for fiction. And he said, poetry is a subjective truth about that leads to an objective reality. So the idea of, how Nina sees the world, and obviously I'm creating this world for Nina, but the subjectivity in that, and the way that I've entered that narrative world. If I go deep enough, and I'm specific enough, and with all the idiosyncrasies and things that go on in this character's life, ideally it rises above that, and it attains. I mean, the goal is anyway to have this objective reality, and ultimately, if we get there, a universality as well.
Tessa, you had a question that connected to what we're talking about, secrets and deceptions. That was very important for you.
Yeah, Nina is really good at hiding. She learned very early on, hiding her relationship with Jorge. And then she hides her disappointment with how her life has turned out from her brothers and from her mother. She hides Daniel, obviously. She hides her dreams. She hides those from herself. So, that whole idea that she's always, it's like her whole reason for being is to keep secrets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has over time, it didn't start that way, but it has over time become the default,
I love the scene where the boys find the extra photos. This woman on a parade float, this very pretty woman. I mean, it's mentioned that she was a very attractive woman. And then you kind of forget, her life is such drudgery. You forget that this was a beautiful, attractive, vivacious woman. And when those boys see those pictures, they're like, wow, qué bonita.
Yeah. And it's a bit of a miracle and a success story that she attained what she did, given all the obstacles that she had in front of her. The struggle was to find her own space, find her own, sovereignty. And she arrives there only to be pulled back eventually. But yes, I mean, this idea of concealing is she knows it. It's the go-to for her at every turn.
And,
I just want to,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry, I was just going to remind everybody that you can ask questions either in the chat, and we'll be sure and ask them.
For some reason, I was going to tell you, Tessa, that in meetings, I can either have the chat go to everybody or go to just me. So I'm going to forward the questions out from the chat room to there. But I did want to say that Alejandro, who has given me enough questions for 2 hours of talking to you, had mentioned in terms of Nina that, that her behavior was culturally accurate, and this idea that her dreams would be secondary to taking care of everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, she's the regime that she's up against of the patriarchy is, she's got her work cut out for her, and it's, I mean, even her mother's in on it, is complicit in all of this. So yeah, she's got it stacked against her.
Oh, her mother. Oh my gosh. Was that? I hope that wasn't taken from anyone you've ever met.
Several people.
Oh!
I remember my uncles berating my father for sending me to a Catholic high school because I was headed for college, because they said he was wasting his money because I would just get married.
Mm.
And my father's response was perfect. He said, "It's my money to waste."
Yeah.
One of the other things I really love about the book is the way you sort of do a bit of a twist at the beginning. The tone of the story almost feels like a thriller at first, with Nina having to deal with the human traffickers. And I call it, and I don't know if anyone else, because it's not even contemporary, but something that Ann Tyler used to do in the 1970s and 80s, where you think a story's going one way and then it just like zigs over in another direction. And I just loved it because it just brought you into the story, but also you do have it, the theme continued, because we were always had a bit of a sense of dread about what could happen, but you were very protective of the main characters, I thought. I was curious if you could talk a little about that.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you that the draft, as we, when we went into editorial, one of the first things we talked about was the structure of the story. We knew that the prologue, those rules were going to stay in place. We knew that wasn't going to shift around. And I don't even know if we were calling it a prologue at that point, but we knew it was going to open there. What happened after that, as I had originally written it, is the story opened in Houston, and it opened with Orly's life, and it wasn't really until, I don't know, page 60 or 70 that you were even introduced to any bit of trafficking. And my editor just felt like the wait was too long, that we needed to swap that order, and brought up exactly the thriller part. The way that, I kind of went back and forth on it. I felt like, one of the things that I didn't want to do, I'll just say from the get-go, was I did not in any way want to sort of there's a term that's been batted around, and I believe, I don't know if I'm getting it right, but immigrant porn, of taking immigrants and putting them in these very harsh situations, and just, you know, sort of you know, staying with that misery. And you know, for me, the story, you know, it wasn't about that. It was, you know, that it was something that occurred in Nina's life, but it did not define Nina. It's a reality of life on the border, but it is not the entirety of life on the border. I mean, just as the drug trafficking and such. I mean, when you hear about the border, that's all you hear about. And yet you've got, you know, millions of people, you know, families living there for generations who have nothing to do with trafficking of any sort. But you know, that's what the media covers. You know, that's the reason to go down to the border, are for you know, to look at these refugee camps, and to you know, look at you know, whatever drug bust there may be. So I never wanted to get into that part of it. The way that I made sense of it was that there was so much that I had already hinted at in the prologue, and even before Nina gets to the point of deciding to help this woman. There's so much that's introduced about her life that I just, you know, yes, there was a thriller aspect of it, but that was not the entirety of it, right? Because you're finding out about this relationship, you're finding out about, you know, that she's been drawn into this family situation that she, you know, worked so hard to escape. I mean, that's the first thing you learn about her, is that she's taking care of this elderly mother who's not an easy person to be around. And it's only after that you get introduced to what exactly the favor is, and then the idea that once she does the first favor, she can't escape the second favor or third one.
Yeah, it had if I can just compare you to other writers, if that's okay. The beginning reminded me a little of Andre Dubuis III's House of Sand and Fog, where there's like a kind of a victim. It's a thriller, but it's sort of a victimless, like a villainless thriller, though there are some bad people, but you know, in terms of Nina. And then I kept thinking after I read this book that it reminded me so much of Kent Haruf. You have such a grace and with your characters. They're just so, like, this is the thing, is like there's so many bad, like that, the way that Orly goes to Matamoros,
yeah.
you know, like wherever you're like, don't go there, don't go there, don't go there, and and he goes there and he doesn't, and he comes back, and at the same time though, something bad has happened, but you know, the way you said, you know, it's there, but it's not in everyone's life at all times.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, people spend a tremendous amount of energy navigating around that. They understand that's you know, unfortunately, particularly if you spend time going back and forth across the border, you know, it's just become a reality of life down there. It's much different than when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s. You know, life as it's lived down there now is you know, I mean, it's still, you know, very attractive, and there's still a lot that you know is wonderful about living there, but there are precautions that people have to take. I mean, it's just it's just a different day now.
Yeah, you refer to that with Nina talking about going to the Mercado in the past. Tessa actually has, she didn't go do the Brownsville Bridge, but she had memories of her childhood.
Sure. You know, I grew up in San Antonio, but my family was from Del Rio, which is also a border town across from Acuña. And I also had distant cousins who were in Eagle Pass across from Piedras Negras and in Laredo across from Nuevo Laredo. And I have gone across at all three of those places. And especially when I was young, I mean, my father loved driving. He just loved to drive. And my parents would say, let's go to Mexico for dinner. It's 150 miles from San Antonio. And we would get the car and we'd go across to go to dinner at Cosby's in Acuña.
Wow.
Because, you know, that's where they wanted to have dinner that night. So, and in those days, now I'm a generation older than you, Oscar. In those days, if you were a Texas resident, you just needed your driver's license to go back and forth.
Yeah.
And you could go as often as you wanted. So it was very much as if it was still a state of Mexico and you were just going back and forth.
Yeah, no, we went practically every week for one thing or another, whether it was for groceries or for dinner or to get a haircut. Get a haircut for a quarter, tip included. It was, you know, I mean, and you know, talk about going out to dinner. I mean, it was simply, you know, where do you want to go? I mean, you know, consider the places in Brownsville, and then, you know, 9 times out of 10, you just decide to go to Matamoros. And really the only consideration was, depending on the time of day, the traffic you might encounter coming back across the bridge. And that was the only thing that might sway the decision.
Well, I think Daniel had mentioned earlier how that sense of place, and you really felt like you knew that place even though you'd never been there. And of course I had been there, not specifically Brownsville, but I've been on the border many times. And I know how hot and dusty it can get and how you want to just stay inside. And one of my jobs when I would visit my grandmother, my brother and I, our job was to water the street every afternoon to keep the dust down.
That's wonderful.
Because she didn't have air conditioning, so the windows were open, and you know, you need to keep the dust down. One of the images I really, really loved that I found very poetic in your book is the parrots flying back and forth.
Oh, yes. Yes, you know, it was funny because they're mentioned throughout the book, but the first mention, I had, for whatever reason, cut it out. I don't know why, what went into that choice, but I had just sort of deleted it or put it aside. And but they came up more prominently later in the book. And you know, as we're going through editing, you know, one of the things that's also happening is they're beginning to design the cover for the book. And you know, it's fascinating, just the mindset and sort of the, you know, what's driving the book designer, and it's basically, I need somebody to pick up this book, whether they're interested in this book or not, that they see it, they make eye contact, and they go to it and they pick it up. There's a magnetism to the book, right? And so they're trying to find whatever provocative image may be mentioned in the book. And so the parrots, they keyed in on the parrots. And we went through probably, I don't know, 4 or 5 different covers. And when they came up with the parrots, and they had all these designs using the parrots on a like a telephone line, but the line was actually a barbed wire. You know, it was nice and clever and such, but I went back and brought that line back into the prologue, and it suddenly fit in a way that it hadn't before, and it basically talked about the parrots going back and forth and not having a home on either side, and wherever they landed, that was their home. And so I'm you know, though we didn't go with the parrots in the cover, I'm grateful to the designer for instigating that, because it would have stayed on the, you know, cutting room floor otherwise.
We should share a lot of people probably have the paperback jacket. This was the hardcover jacket. I think people should see that. So done. Okay, just for a little moment. One thing, our book club that I run met last night, and everybody was completely in love with your italicized passages. I sometimes get a little afraid when I see things in italics, but after a couple of these, I couldn't wait until you had another one. I think this was partly your skill as a short story writer too, is like you brought these people to life, and you sometimes played with us, and I love the way sort of the camera would go zoom in and out, sort of like the way we see people as others, and then the way we can get close to them and see them fully realized. Tell me did you always have that in the story, or did you add that later, or what?
I had it pretty early on. I mean, I remember when the structure was, as I mentioned, starting in Houston and then eventually getting to Brownsville, that Orly and his father in Houston had brushed up against some immigrants, and the idea was basically that, and you know, I mean, yes, for the characters, but for all of us, you know, this is a you know, I mean, it's cliched, but it's true. You know, this is a country of immigrants, not just in the past tense, but in the very current contemporary sense of that, and they're all around us. Maybe not so much these days because we're, you know, quarantined, but when we're out and about, we're brushing up against these lives, and yet we don't really know anything about them. We don't know what brought them here, what their you know, what their dreams were, what they gave up, you know, the sense of place in the world that they carry with them, what their aspirations are. And so the idea was to have these moments that gave us these snapshots. And I don't know that I quite designed it this way. It ended up, I think, just after a while becoming this, which is that the principal characters in the novel never find these things out, right? So, you know, for instance, there is a scene, you know, early in the book where Orly and his father are driving to Brownsville, and they're going into the King Ranch, which is this massive piece of land. I mean, it takes an hour to drive across, and it's nothing but mesquite and it's just ranch land. And as they're going through that, they see this milk jug just sort of tumbling across the road, and he sees it, but I mean, it's just some trash. And at that point, the story goes to the italicized section, and it tells the story of the last person to carry it, which was this immigrant, this older woman who was being taken north through the ranch and hadn't made it. So Orly doesn't know anything about this. There are several other, these come up every so often, but in each instance, the main characters are oblivious to these lives. And I wanted to stay true to that, because I didn't want this moment, you know. And there's ways that even when some of that happens with Daniel, the boy who comes to stay in the pink house, there are things that he keeps to himself, that he just knows not to share. And you know, to me, it felt like giving them their dignity, their space, and you know, personhood mainly.
Well,
You did a great job. Go on, Tessa.
one of the things though is that the Mexicanos from this side are voice a lot of prejudice against those from the other side. You know, they refer to them as mojados, which is wetbacks. And, you know, that was why her family disapproved of her going out with Jorge, because they called him a mojado, even though Jorge was born on this side of the river. His mother was born on the other side.
Yeah.
So there's a real prejudice from an immigrant who's only been here 1 or 2 generations against those who are trying to come now.
Close that door behind them. I mean, they just, you know, they got here, and I mean, unfortunately, it's a fairly typical story, and I don't think we have any, you know, exclusive rights to it. But yeah, I mean, you know,
today's Times, I don't know if you saw, today's Times had documented the metro areas with the greatest swing towards Democrats or Republicans, and the top 3 metro areas were all border communities. And Brownsville was 3 of swinging towards Trump. You know, in my culture, it was the German Jews versus the Russian Jews. You know, in the 1850s. So,
yeah,
you know,
I mean,
everybody's got it. So
yeah, I was gonna. I'm glad you brought that up. I was gonna mention Zapata County, which is, you know, up river, and this was the one that flipped for Trump. Yeah, I mean, it's you know. You know, that's a pretty stark example of it, and I think a sobering and awakening one. I understood it. I understood that always existed. I didn't imagine that it was to that degree, quite frankly. So I was as surprised as everyone else. But that there was this you know, very complicated history and relationship to you know, to immigration, and when you arrived, and who these people were who were coming in, literally just a generation, sometimes not even that, you know. And you know, it's sad but true. You know, so I didn't want to, and part of the, you know, we haven't really touched on it, but for me, so much of this, you know, once I realized, okay, I'm in the middle of this issue, and quite frankly, you know, I think we talked about my starting it, fully committing to it in 2015, and I had probably been thinking about it at least a couple of years before that. I did not want to write a political book. I mean, that was just not my inclination. That it might have some of that in there. Yeah, I thought that might come up. For me, I wanted to see if there was a way to strip it of the politics, quite frankly. There was when we were in editing, right, when we were, you know, flopping the or you know, flipping the structure, I got an email from the Washington Post asking me if I would be interested in writing an opinion piece for them, because, as it turned out, the government had decided to start separating children from their parents. And, you know, while it was like, wow. I mean, I was like, really? I mean, at first I couldn't believe it. And then it felt so huge. I mean, it was like, I don't even know where to begin with this. And in part, I don't know where to begin with it because there is just so much noise out there. And I did not want to be another person just screaming, bloody murder. I don't feel like that gets us anywhere. And so, and though I was enraged, I didn't know how to respond. And I asked her to give me a night to think about it. And in the morning, I emailed her just a single line. And all the line said was, and I should mention, this was also about the time that someone had recorded the children crying, and the tape had been released, and there's these children are just wailing. And so the email said, what language are they crying in? And she said, write that. And so it all dealt with, you can't tell if someone's crying in Spanish or in German or, Mandarin or whatever. It's a human issue. And to get it down to that humanitarian level. So, in a way, Beto, as unsettling as his views are, and the comments that he makes about the Mojados and this and that, he stands in as that voice of that that person out there. And I don't want to get into he's forgotten where he came from, or he's forgotten his heritage. I'm not as interested in that, but I am interested in the idea of shutting off a part of yourself. And there is clearly a way in that book that he has sort of insulated himself from the issue. They are the other, and then he's got his own life. And I think what eventually happens is that it's so front and center, it's so in his face that he cannot deny it, and he has to sort of face up to it. And when he does, I won't say that it changes him, but it startles him that that it could be that piercing. And that he was very, very aggressively pursuing this way of thinking.
We have a couple of questions that I'm probably like sort of a lightning round, I guess. So one person played on your discovering reading and wanted to know who were some of the influential authors that made you become an avid reader.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I bounced all over, because that suddenly, all the things that I had slept through in college were suddenly like, oh, that was actually kind of interesting. I started going back and auditing all these courses. Not only would I audit the course, but I'd ask the professor if I could take the test. And I ended up getting like the best score, in these tests. And the professor was just like, oh my God, you have these 18, 19-year-olds sleeping through the course. And there's this, at the time I was probably about 33, 34. And I just couldn't get enough of it. So I initially took an American Survey course, and just all the typical, the usual suspects of Hemingway and Faulkner. But eventually, I kept asking people, give me a list, tell me what to read, I will read it. And eventually, people were very, I don't know why, maybe I was just a little too, gung-ho. And so I ended up having to do a lot of my own research as to where you know, who were the writers that inspired these other writers that I was, you know, initially exposed to. So that, you know, that took me to Chekhov, and that took me to Isaac Babel, and that got me to Flannery O'Connor, you know, eventually, you know, Raymond Carver and Toni Morrison, some of the Mexican writers, Juan Rulfo, you know, Garcia Marquez. But I was really like all over the place. And you know, for me, at least initially, it was this sense of urgency, because I had jumped ship. I had basically left all ways of earning a living behind me, and decided that I would give this a shot without having published anything, and having no clue as to what I had stepped into. And so, you know, part of my reading was to figure out what these writers were doing. How were they doing it? How were they having that effect on me? You know, what was that way that I tensed up when I read that one line where the story seemed to shift? You know, how did they orchestrate this? How did they seem to bring everything down, you know, to sort of collapse on itself at the very end? How was that happening? And yeah, the only way I could find that out was by immersing myself in you know, these different books.
One last question from our audience. Someone asked about, you know, you've now written 3 books that seem to all take place in the same general area. Is there a Cásares universe? Do any of the story characters from Brownsville overlap with these characters? Do you ever plan to do, you know, the way the writer, we're not talking about, those people asked about a sequel, and I think one of our people tonight and one yesterday talked about like what was going to happen to Danielle after this, but also side characters. Was there anybody? So we've got a lot of ways to go with this question. So
Yeah.
is there anybody like you have so many characters with such life in them. I had said to the person last night, I don't mean to speak for you. I'm like, I don't know if he likes to do a sequel though. Depends how well the book does. But also, was there a character in this that you said this side character has a novel in them? I'd love to know more.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's you're right, and I mean, particularly with, I think, the immigrants that are, you know, have those italicized sections. They're I mean, just about every one of them could at least be a story, if not a novel. I mean, the one that stands out to me is you know, Orly has this instructor, this teacher, who opens him up to all these different authors to read, and this way of thinking about the world, and thinking about, and the teacher is from Veracruz, and has been living in the States for a couple of years. And Orly, you know, finds, you know, it looks up to him. And there's one of the italicized sections just after Orly has been thinking about him, thinking about emailing him. We show the teacher, and he's getting in his car to go to the park for a run, to Memorial Park, which is a big park in Houston. And these ICE officers show up, and they're not looking for him, but they're looking for his boyfriend. And the boyfriend isn't around. The boyfriend moved out months earlier, and they start asking questions about him. And it turns out that he's overstayed his visa. So he should have left, you know, months earlier. And this is, this is part of the story that we've been living through, certainly the last 4 years of collateral damage. They don't find the perpetrator that they're after, the person who's got the record, whatever it may be, and so they just pick up whoever else they can nab at the moment. And I mention him because there was so much of how his presence in the classroom, he was almost he was opening a world up for Orly, and then it was just sort of shut down. But you also found out that he had a world in the country, and then he had a world back in Mexico, where he was unfortunately going to have to go back to.
I love this section. I'm so glad when you were mentioning, I was like, oh, I hope he talks about that. So I'm going to leave the last question for Tessa.
Well, you talked a lot in one of the interviews I saw with you about the oral storytelling tradition, and you mentioned it several times here. And I also grew up with those stories, on a summer evening, sitting on the porch with my grandmother and my Tia Maria, who was really my grandmother's cousin, and a couple of my uncles, and they'd be telling us all these stories. And of course, a lot of them were scary stories. The man all in black with the little dog with red eyes that walks by the railroad track at night. Or La Llorona, because
classic.
There was a creek real near my grandmother's house. So we weren't close enough to the Rio Grande for that to be an issue, but the creek was definitely an issue. And I was surprised that you didn't include La Llorona in here with the canal being there. She didn't even once mention La Llorona. Daniel didn't mention La Llorona when he was sitting under the bridge.
No, I mean, somebody brought, and again, if it happens naturally, it happens naturally. But otherwise, I'm not gonna like impose that. After the fact, somebody mentioned, and again, like, I mean, I'm aware of it, but again, I'm not imposing it. But somebody made the comparison of Orly and Daniel going to get the snow cones and crisscrossing the canal, in some way mirroring Huck and Jim on the river. Yeah, I mean, those stories, and I've worked some of those stories into my other books. I mean, in particular, the second book, Amigo Land, which is based on a family legend, and really the first story that I ever heard, and really, once I tell you, you'll maybe figure out why I became a writer. But my tío Nico would tell this story that the family was in Linares, Nuevo León, which is roughly about 100 miles due south of the river, and they were at a festival, and this was mid 1800s, and it was a time when the U.S. was pushing the Native Americans south, and Mexico was pushing them north, and at one point even had a bounty on them. And so there was a lot of hostility and a lot of skirmishes. And this one day they attacked this festival. And my great grandfather was at the festival. He was a little boy. He was there with his family. The Indians attacked. They burned most of the place down, killed many of the adults. But as they often did, they abducted all the kids that they could find, the littler ones. And my great grandfather was all of maybe 4 or 5 years old at the time. And they put him on the horse, and they started riding northward, and the Mexican army was in pursuit. and they rode all night, and they're gaining on them, but they're losing them, and they're gaining on them, they're losing them. And finally they get to the river. And, you know, this is, I believe it was like 1850, 1851, you know, the river had just become the international boundary. They cross to the north side of the river and they stop. And they take one child and they leave him on the banks of the river. And then they take off again. And that child was my great, 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 great grandfather. And that's how we arrived in Texas, right? And I would, you imagine hearing that when you're whatever, 6 or 7, I'm like, are you kidding me? And my uncle swore by it. He just swore by it. So, you know, I did end up working it into this, the second book, but along the way, you know, my father would say, your uncle's crazy. Okay, your uncle is just like, don't believe a damn word that your uncle says. And but it sounds very real. Well, it's not real. Well, where did we come from? Well, I don't know where we came from, but we didn't come from there. And so finally I went back to Linares to see if I could find any proof of this, and that this was even, you know, plausible. And I go to the municipal building. I should have, you know, there's a sort of protocol, but I didn't know what I was doing. I just showed up one day, and the administrative person there says, "What can I help you?" And I explained to her, and she said, "Well, what exactly is it?" And so I go, "Well, let me tell you this story," and I tell her the story that I just told you, and she's like, "Oh my God!" And she picks up the phone and she calls the licenciado upstairs, her boss, and she rushes me upstairs and she says, "Tell him what you just told me. Tell him." And so I tell the guy, and he's like, "That's amazing." And he picks up the phone and he calls another person. There was about 4 or 5 phone calls that were made. What I came to find out was that not only had it happened, but it had happened with some frequency, that this was something that people in that region had dealt with quite a bit. But that these children were never heard of again. And generation after generation would talk about the child that was taken from them. And they never knew. And so, you know, 150 years go by and this guy shows up and says, "I've got the other piece of the puzzle for you," essentially. And they were like, and so they directed me to the archivist for the community, but then also for the entire state. And he had written 3 or 4 books simply on that topic of the Indian raids. And it's fascinating if you know, of course this was happening, you know, throughout Texas and the Midwest and such. It wasn't just in northern Mexico. But you know, that idea of you know, bringing that piece that they were waiting for, it was fascinating. There's an essay, if you're interested in that story, and it gets into how my name became my name, or my surname anyway. There's an essay in Texas Monthly that talks about that trip.
Well, that is the story to end an evening. That's just, I was like, just like you as a child, was like, thank you so much for this wonderful evening. I can't highly, I mean, we did try to get as many folks as possible to read the book, but if you haven't read and haven't bought your copy of Where We Come From, I sent you a link to purchase. If you're not local, purchase it at any independent bookstore you love, but we do have it. And I wanted to thank Tessa Bartels, who did a wonderful job as always.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. And we hope your next book will come faster. You take as long as
you're
you
not
need.
the only one.
Yeah.
I'll mention one other thing. If there are any folks out there who read in Spanish, and this is a quick little anecdote, that once the book was, once we finished the editing, we had to start on the Spanish language translation, and I'm fluent, but I'm not that fluent. So they sent it off, and it came back, and the challenge now was to adapt that translator's Spanish to the border Spanish, and painstakingly going through every line to make it sound like it was actually happening on the border and it was not translated in Mexico City, where the Spanish is impeccable, but it's not authentic to that region. And so I'll say that without revealing too much, that is sort of where I'm picking up the thread for the next book, is in the translation and the experience with the language.
I just mentioned in our notes that we do have a copy in Spanish too, if somebody's interested, they can purchase it from us. So, well, that's good. I'm glad you have your next idea.
Well, I'm sorry we're leaving because that just made me think of another question, but that's okay.
You are a special person, Tessa, because you can ask privately. So I'll send a thank you note from both of us, and you'll have the email to ask the question.
So
but an hour, honestly, we're going on 90 minutes. So I think we have to say goodnight now. Thank you, everyone.
Translating it into Spanish, one of the things that struck me is because it's very common on the border to mix English and Spanish in your conversation. So even the section that you read, she talks about wearing her house dress and her chanclas. And so I can't understand how you can get that feel if the whole thing's in Spanish. Are you going to?
Yeah, my initial thought was that my initial thought was that it was going to simply go the other way, and it didn't quite work that way. That everything that was going to Spanish would now go to English, and it would just, and it happens to a certain degree. There are things that when they're speaking Spanish, they just say in English because it's more convenient. But it was a negotiation with every single word had to be sort of, and the amount of time that I spent debating with my Spanish language editor, just a word, it was fascinating. I mean, I loved the experience, but it was an ordeal. Thank you, Daniel.
Oh, pleasure. Thank you. The thanks are all ours. So, we've gotten a whole bunch of notes talking from attendees saying how much they love the event, and I'm so excited to be able to continue to hand sell this in our store. So thank you. And thanks everybody.
And selection for the Hispanic Professionals of Greater Milwaukee Book Club in the future.
Wonderful. That's great to hear. And maybe we can get other book clubs interested in it too. So we have a little book club list. It's on it. So it's one of our big 24. So we'll keep on pushing. So thanks everybody for coming. Have a wonderful evening. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. And
thank you, Tessa.
You're welcome.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Sleep tight. Hasta mañana.